probably spend more time with maps than I do with people. Poring over old maps and documents and books. I just love history. Welcome to Tingledom. Hello, I am Edwina Mortensen. So delighted to meet you today. Oh, yes, I do spend quite a bit of time at the Tingledom Library. It is such a repository of information. But someone suggested that maybe there were people who would enjoy if I did some of these sessions. So I will be doing them the first Monday of every month. I'll be camped out here at the Map Mansion. Such lovely surrounds. Yes, and today we're looking at the history and the naming of Delaware. So I've divided this session into 5 sections. So we'll be first looking at the Native American history. We'll only touch on that briefly. My specialty tends to be in cartography, and as there were not many large-scale maps made by Native Americans, it's not my specialty, but I do always like to make sure we're aware of the people who have been there for a very long time. And then we'll move into the first European colony, which was the Dutch in Delaware. And then we'll move into the Swedish and the interaction between the Swedish and the Dutch. And then we'll discuss the English colony. And then we'll talk about the Declaration of Delaware and its beginning as an entity. So I have a variety of maps to take us through this. So, you see, if we first start, we'll look at the Nanticoke and Lenape. These are the native peoples to this area. Now, North America, there are differing ideas among archaeologists in how long Native Americans have been on the continent. A date that is accepted by all is 15,000 years ago, but there is suggestion that it could be a long time before then. And we do know that they arrived through the Bering Strait and settled the continent from that area. But we're not really sure on the timings and how long that took. So, these are the lands at the time of European discovery isn't the right word, but awareness, shall we say, of North America. So you can see the Nanticoke here. If we bring this a little closer for you, you can see the Nanticoke are right here along the Nanticoke River. And then the Lenape actually covered vast regions. So you can see Delaware to Maryland to Pennsylvania to New York. But you can see this southern section of the Lenape goes basically to this part. So it was the northern part of Delaware is the Lenape, and then the Nanticoke were down in this area. Now, one of those interesting tidbits that I love about the Lenape is that they're actually a matrilineal clan. So people would have land ownership, and that as as they understood it, which is different from European conception, obviously, but it was held by the mother's line, and it was expected that a mother's sons would go and marry someone else from a different clan. And so they were the ones who moved, and the daughters would stay. So, just a little brief bit about the Lenape. So now, let's move on and talk about the Dutch. First, I must say, with this map that we have, which is of course just a printout, it is a much too priceless map for us to use in these sort of sessions, though I have actually seen an original. So this is a map that was made by Johannes Vikboons, and he was Dutch. And the interesting thing you'll see here, so what we would now call Delaware Bay, you can see has the name Godin's Bay. And the name for that is because Samuel Godin was a part of that colony. So the Dutch, it was the Dutch West India Company, and they came to the Delaware area, and they spoke with some Nanticoke. So we're down towards Nanticoke, towards the Nanticoke River. This is near present-day Lewis, but we'll talk about that a little later. Just pop that back on. And so in 1632, they arranged a purchase of land from the Nanticoke people for establishing a colony. And so that colony was established, and they called it Swanendale, which means Swan Hill. But it was a very short-lived colony because there was a disagreement with the local Nanticoke Native Americans. The customs were not the same between these people, and the Dutch became very upset when the Dutch West India logo was what they considered defaced by the Native Americans. And then the Native Americans were unhappy with the response by the Dutch, and so they came and they killed all 32 Dutch that were there. And that ended the Swanendale colony. Now the Dutch's claim to having a colony in the New World is connected to international law, mainly among Europe at the time, which basically considered that the first Christian to cast eyes on a land and make a claim for it was then entitled to that land. And so the Dutch considered that they were eligible for a claim because in 1609 Henry Hudson did first cast eyes on the Delaware area in Delaware Bay. It's quite an interesting story, actually. So Henry Hudson is English, but he did first start doing his journeys for England. He was trying to find a way through China across the North Pole. He thought he would be able to sail that way and make it quicker. And it's quite treacherous up there, and his journeys failed, and the English thought they would cut his purse strings. So he went to the Dutch, they sponsored him. He went and he was going around the edge of Russia. There was discontent among the crew, and they insisted that they turn around, and that's when they ended up going and exploring along the edge of the eastern side of North America. And that's when he would have explored the areas of the Hudson Bay and the like, for which are obviously named for him. And so the Dutch considered, because they had bankrolled this, which was as the custom, that they had a claim to this area of North America because he had come to Delaware Bay. But that wasn't necessarily what ended up standing, but we'll get to that later. Now, the other story comes with Peter Minuit. So, New Nederland, which is where they made Swanendel, was under, obviously. That was a failed colony, but there were other areas of New Nederland that did exist. And they were all of these colonies were headed by Peter Minuit. And he and the Dutch West India Company ended up being on unhappy terms with each other. And so he said, I'm going to go to the Swedish. And that is how we ended up with a Swedish colony. But we'll get to that in just a moment. Finishing off with the Dutch. The Dutch never yielded their claim, so in 1651, they then made Fort Casimir, which is present-day Newcastle, which you'll see on many maps. But so if you see on our next map, you'll actually see it Fort Casimir and Newcastle. So you'll know where it is, but it's up at the other end of Delaware. And so Casimir is named actually for Polish kings who have been very successful in battle. Just a fun tidbit there. But let us get on now to Sweden. You can see Fort Casimir here. Now only this bottom part actually corresponds to Delaware. We get up into New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and the like on this. So you can see Fort Casimir here, and then Christina, which is present-day Wilmington. Now this is not an ancient map. This map, I should have said, was made in 1634, so quite an old map. Whereas when we look at this map, it actually comes from 1914. And you can see after Amandus Johnson, it's a simplification of a map that was made by Amandus Johnson, and it is in his very well-respected tome, The Swedish Settlement on the Delaware, from 1638 to 1664. So if you are interested in the Swedish history, that is a great resource. It's about 700 pages, but fascinating piece of history. So, as we spoke about, Minuit, he left the Dutch and he came to the Swedish. And the Swedish then created the Swedish South Company. And when they made the Swedish South Company, they then let Minuit head up their colony. He came up the Delaware River, and he made Christina, which is present-day Wilmington. Now, Minuit did not survive much longer. He died in a hurricane that very same year. So we didn't get to see much of what became of Christina, that colony. Now, after he died, when the Dutch established Fort Casimir, the Swedish then decided that they were going to attack. So they attacked. The governor led an attack on Fort Casimir. But this was a miscalculation because by 1655, the Dutch had well and truly won that battle, and the Swedish were forced to abandon their colonies, and thus ended the New Sweden colony. So, it wasn't the longest period of time for them. Then we move to the British. With this map, we have the Nova Tabula Geographica. This comes from 1717, and I have a couple zoomed-in versions as well, so we can see the Delaware portions in a bit more detail. But I also have a map from 1719, which is an updated version of a 1685 map, but we'll get into that. But what we'll note with these maps is the boundaries and what the area of Delaware is actually called. But we'll get to that. The important part comes into why did the British consider that they should actually have a right to settle in Delaware. If Henry Hudson had been in 1609, then shouldn't it be the Dutch who had the claim? Well, the claim of the English was that John Cabot, when he sailed in 1497, had entered the Delaware Bay, over here, and also that when John Smith established the Virginia Company, that he also had been in these areas, and so that they had an earlier claim and thus were more entitled to the area. In the end, though, it was probably the show of force that made them more successful than any wins in courtrooms or anything like that. In 1664, James, at the time, was the Duke of York and brother to the king, and he had enough money to outfit a contingent that was able to come over and, without any issue, pushing the Dutch out of the Delaware area and also out of the Hudson area. But that's for another time. And so it was fairly straightforward that the British ruled this area. But what was less clear was who among the British should actually rule this area. So what we'll see in this map, a lovely Nicholas Fisher map from 1717, as I said, is, you can see in this map, this area is not called Delaware, which, as you can guess from our itinerary through this journey today, the name of Delaware for this specific area was not officially adopted until 1776. But it was a separate political entity before that. But Maryland, so Cecil Calvert, who was the head of Maryland, thought that they had claim over this area. But because the claim that had started Maryland said that they only had access to the unclaimed lands, and because the Dutch had technically built these colonies, and then the Swedish as well, those were not uncultivated lands. I should say, sorry, not unclaimed. Uncultivated. And so there was actually a long legal battle, which ends up being with Penn. We'll get to him. But, so, it's a big, messy story. So I just want to show you these maps real quick first. So you can see here, here's Newcastle. And obviously we've got the bay here. And there's actually a bit of a flaw with a lot of the maps from this time as compared to where Cape Henlopen should be versus Fenwick Island. When we talk about the borders, it'll make more sense why that matters. But essentially, Maryland was supposed to begin at Cape Henlopen, which is about up here, and it ended up being Fenwick Island. Not these actual places, but... So, a bit of a drama for where Maryland lost a bit of land. And then the other map I wanted to show, though, this is from 1719. And you can see, and this is an English map. That other map was actually from an atlas that was made by the Dutch again. So I'm not sure if they were as interested in the ongoings between the border disputes of Lord Baltimore, and Penn wasn't into the story. Well, he was at that point. So lots of mess around that. But you can see here that this part of Delaware, we've still got some of Delaware that's not included there. But you can see that we've got a lot more. And it's actually in this time under Pennsylvania. Now this map was made originally by Christopher Brown in 1685. And then the version that we see here is an updated version, updated by Senex, who was one of the principal cartographers in Europe of the 18th century. So very big news at the time. So the disputes among the English parties came at particular times. So Maryland always thought they had a claim to this area of Delaware. But when the Duke of York was making claim to this area, Cecil Calvert, who was the governor of Maryland, was much less concerned in this area because this was going to be the future king. He was next in line. And obviously brother to the king at the time as well. And so he wasn't that interested in pressing the claim. However, William Penn had his areas up here. And William Penn was quite upset to find out that he had no outlet to the sea. So part of the borders for the area of Delaware was not called such at the time, but it said that for Newcastle, for a 12-mile radius, that would be the end of Pennsylvania, so that it couldn't touch on the 12-mile radius. But the problem is that 12-mile radius is what allows you to get out the bay into the ocean. And having a colony without access to the ocean in a seafaring society was not very useful. And so William Penn pled with the Duke of York, and the Duke of York assented and leased him these areas. Well, once the colony was not in the hands of the king-to-be, then Lord Baltimore was much more interested in it. So Penn and Baltimore had a legal battle that stretched out actually for generations between the two of them. The original ones died, their sons kept it up, and it was finally settled with the borders that we have today. Now, William Penn is an important figure for Delaware history. So we can see here that with this lease, William Penn and then his descendants had control over Pennsylvania and then also what was called at the time the lower counties. So because they were downriver, that's why they were considered the lower counties. And they were the 3 counties. We'll get into those at the end. But the 3 counties did not necessarily think that all of their interests were being represented, because as Pennsylvania grew and grew, because of the geography of Delaware, or the lower counties on the Delaware, as they were known at the time, they did not have as much room for expansion inland. They didn't have mountainous regions to export. There was just the land that they had, basically. Whereas obviously Pennsylvania could be a gateway to the west. And so they had very different needs. So they pled with William Penn, and he allowed them to create their own General Assembly. So then they were basically had the same governor, but they were administered as two different entities. So the lower counties on the Delaware is the earliest version that we see of the Delaware that we know today. Now you may be curious where the name Delaware originally comes from. So it comes from Lord Baron Delaware, who was the governor of Virginia, basically around the time that the Delaware Bay was starting to be used as a name by the English. So rather than using the name Gaudens Bay, they may not have even known that the Dutch were using the name Gaudens Bay. They used the word Delaware Bay, and that went on. Tracking back a little more, Delaware is a name that has been attached to a baron for a long period of time. Thomas West, I believe, was the third, he was Thomas West the eighth baron of Baron Delaware. But that actually has an Anglo-Saxon origin. It's what we know as a lieu-dit, which means a name that is given based on a place. But Delaware, the best that we can surmise is that it was related to de la guerre, which would have meant basically a belligerent and unhappy man who was happy to go to war, basically. So, Delaware, that's where we get the name. That's where we get the name for the bay, the lower counties on the Delaware, and eventually we'll get there. To understand, though, the borders for the lower counties on the Delaware, I think we're best looking at a contemporary map. So the only border that's wrong here is this one, because this map comes from the 1925 Atlas. Back here. But the 1925 Atlas, I know, everyone's been talking about it. I just thought it would be nice for these sessions to have an actual atlas. Delaware's a bit small, so I wanted to make it a bit bigger, though. So for some of the other ones, we will use the actual atlas. But so you'll see this one, because that wasn't actually settled until the 1930s. Early on, the borders for the sea didn't really matter that much, so it felt pretty obvious where the borders were, but it became quite an issue. So it's one of the only borders. It's actually here, so 12 miles either side of Newcastle. It is the low tide line of New Jersey. I know. So you could be on the beach and then walk in New Jersey and then walk into Delaware. Bit crazy. Anyway, now we've discussed this border. That's that curve, that 12-mile radius around Newcastle. And then we have these two borders. The western border got settled in the 1760s. Mason and Dixon were sent to investigate, and so they surveyed this line and this line, the famous Mason and Dixon line. They did not, however, survey the southern border. This one had been surveyed previously. It was just supposed to run directly east from the line that ran directly as a direct tangent from the end of the circle down to that point. So, very straight lines here. And that is how they got the borders of Delaware. But of course, if we have the lower counties on the Delaware, what are these counties? Well, in the present day, we have 3 counties. We have Newcastle County. Can you guess what that's named for? Kent County and Sussex County. Newcastle County was established in 1673 when Fort Casimir was established. Now, the thing to understand is, so I said I would point out Lewis. This is where Lewis is, just to orient you with where we've been looking earlier. So this is Cape Henlopen, and this is where Fenwick Island is. So they lost a little bit of area there. Now, to understand in those times why they would have wanted to have another county, with all the settlements, all the new property lines, lots of people needed courts to settle disputes, and the only courts were in the county seat. And so if you were down in Lewis, you probably wouldn't want to travel up to Newcastle. So that explains why they expanded to 3 counties, because this down here was always its own county, basically. When it was under Lord Baltimore, it was Durham County. Then when it was under the Duke of York, it was Deal County. It's also been known as Hernkill County, Susan County, but they've settled, and it's currently Sussex County. But we've had these 2 counties for a long period of time. But in the center, what if you lived there? You would have had to travel either down here or up there. And in those days, travel that distance was quite difficult. And so they wanted to establish another county. And so on the 21st of June, 1680, they established St. John's County, which is now known as Kent County. So that is a lot of names, but they eventually got to where we have them today. Now, when did Delaware become Delaware? If you guessed 1776, you'd be correct. If you would guess the 4th of July, 1776, you would be wrong. Now, Delaware did declare independence on the 4th of July. There was actually a horse ride with an important voter who had to break a tie so that he could come. Not really here nor there, but a rather thrilling tale. Well, for those in Delaware. But it was the 15th of June, 1776. And Delaware declared itself as Delaware, not just the lower counties on the Delaware, because it declared independence from Britain, but it also at the same time declared independence from Pennsylvania. So at that time they decided they wanted to have their own president. They didn't want to be under the Pennsylvania governor anymore, and so they declared their independence. And then they did again with all the other colonies that did at that time. And that is how Delaware became a colony and then the first state of the United States. I hope you've enjoyed this. It's my first time doing this. I've only given one other talk before, so I really hope you enjoyed it. If you have any ideas or feedback for what you might be interested in when we discuss Delaware and all the other states, don't feel free to drop me a note at the Tingledom Library. I'll be more than happy to read it. And I do hope you will come next month when I talk about Pennsylvania. Again, first Monday of the month. Oh yes, and of course, the Bat Mansion will be here for you for